The morning Harlan
It
Cade
gets
rode
harder
into
every day.
Sweetwater Flats with the deed in
The
his
quiet in
saddlebag.
this house is
The
deafening.
sky was the particular shade
I
of
miss the
gray
sound
that
of voices,
old-timers called a liar
but
sky.
they're all gone now.
Bright enough to look like sunshine was coming, dark enough to know better. He came in from the north, the direction nobody used in October, because the trail through Kettle Canyon flooded when the first cold rains hit. And yet there he was, his gray roan picking its way carefully along the main street, like the horse itself understood that what was about to happen deserved a measured entrance. May Aldrich was the first to see him. She had been sweeping the porch of the general store, her father's general store, which was slowly becoming her general store in the way that unmarked graves slowly become part of the landscape, inevitable and unremarked upon. She stopped sweeping. Her broom handle rested against the railing, and she watched Harlan Cade pass, without calling out to him, without lifting her hand. She just watched, and somewhere in the watching, her face arranged itself into an expression that nobody in Sweetwater Flats had ever seen on May Aldrich before. It was the expression of a woman who already knows how the story ends. He stopped in front of the cattleman's bank. He did not go inside. He tied his horse to the post, reached into his saddlebag with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who had rehearsed this moment privately, possibly for years, and he removed a rolled document sealed with red wax. He held it in both hands. He looked at it. Then he looked up at the building across the street, not the bank, but the building next to it, the narrow two-story structure with the faded painted letters that read Sweetwater Land Registry and Civil Records. He walked toward it. May Aldrich set down her broom and followed him at a distance of 20 feet. By the time Harlan Cade reached the door of the Land Registry, there were 7 people watching. Sweetwater Flats had a population of 212, and on a Tuesday morning in October, a significant portion of them found reasons to be on or near Main Street. Word moved through small towns the way weather moved, not communicated so much as felt. The barber, Enos Pruitt, came to stand in his doorway. Judge Tate's clerk, a nervous young man named Desmond, who wore his hat slightly too large for his head, pressed himself against the window of the courthouse. Doc Fenner paused on the steps of his office, and Vera Hollis, who ran the boarding house, and who had the distinction of being the only person in town who knew every other person's business and kept all of it, emerged from the alley between the bank and the milliner's shop as though she had simply materialized. The door to the Land Registry was locked. It was 8:43 in the morning, and the registrar, Mr. Burl Hayden, did not open until 9. Harlan Cade knocked once. He waited. He knocked again. Not loud, not impatient. The knock of a man who has the luxury of patience, because he has already won. May Aldrich crossed the street. She came up behind him quickly. She was a quick woman, quick in thought and movement and judgment, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Harlan, don't." He turned and looked at her. He was 61 years old, and his face showed every year of it in the good way. The way that faces do when the years have been full of weather and work and trouble earnestly faced. He was not a handsome man, but he was a substantial one. You felt his presence the way you felt a good stone wall. Not decorative, but real. "Morning, May," he said. "Don't do this," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you've got in that document, don't." "Why not?" She looked at him for a moment, and something passed across her face that was not quite an answer. "Because things are settled here," she said finally. "Things are the way they are. You go in there and you file that, and nothing will be settled anymore." "That's rather the point," he said. The lock clicked. Burl Hayden opened the door from inside. He had apparently arrived early through the back, and blinked at Harlan Cade, and then at May Aldrich, and then at the small crowd that had assembled on the street. Burl Hayden was the kind of man who processed information slowly, but held it forever. He stepped back and let Harlan in without a word. May Aldrich followed. She did not ask permission, and none was offered. The Land Registry smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular mustiness of records that nobody wanted found. The walls were shelved floor to ceiling with ledgers and rolls. A single window let in the gray October light. Burl Hayden settled behind his desk with the expression of a man who wished he had stayed home. Harlan Cade placed the document on the counter. "I'd like to file a land transfer," he said. May Aldrich made a sound. It was not quite a word. It was the sound a person makes when they reach for something they expected to be there and find empty air. Burl Hayden looked at the document. He broke the wax seal carefully. Everything Burl did was careful, cautious, as though the universe might punish recklessness, and unrolled it and read. His face changed color twice. Then he looked up at Harlan Cade. "This is," he started. "Legal," Harlan said. "You'll find all the signatures in order." "This transfers the deed to Cade Ranch," Burl said slowly, as though the words might mean something different if he said them at reduced speed. "To the town of Sweetwater Flats. The whole of it, for 1,830 acres, the water rights on Cade Creek, the grazing leases on the northern pasture, the structures, the livestock inventory." "Yes," Harlan said. "To be held as common land," Burl continued, reading now with the expression of a man reading his own obituary. "Accessible to any resident of the township, managed by a board of no fewer than 5 elected members, one of whom must be—" He paused and looked up again. "A woman." Silence. In the silence, a fly buzzed against the window glass. May Aldrich sat down on the bench along the wall. She did not choose to sit down. Her legs made the choice for her. "Harlan," she said. Her voice had changed. The urgency was gone from it. What replaced it was something older and less certain. "Harlan, you cannot do this." "The legality is sound," he said, still facing the counter. "I am not talking about the legality." He turned then. He looked at her on the bench. May Aldrich, who had kept this general store since she was 16, who had buried a father and a fiancé and 2 brothers, who had never in the memory of any living person in Sweetwater Flats asked for help or comfort or acknowledgement, who was now sitting on a hard wooden bench with her hands flat on her thighs looking at him like he had just pulled the floor out from under everything she knew. "File it, Burl," Harlan said. Burl Hayden picked up his pen. His hand was not entirely steady. The scratching of the pen nib was the loudest sound in the world. The news moved through Sweetwater Flats in 11 minutes. Vera Hollis saw to that. She had been at the window the whole time, and she had excellent hearing, and she moved through the town with the quiet, efficient speed of a river finding its course. By 10 o'clock, there were 30 people in the street. By 10:30, there were more, and they had begun to argue. The argument took several forms. The first form was disbelief. Surely Harlan had lost his mind. Surely the document would be challenged. Surely Judge Tate would find some legal remedy. The second form was suspicion. What was Harlan getting out of this? Because men like Harlan Cade did not give away 4,000 acres unless there was a scheme involved. The third form, which emerged more slowly and spoke more quietly than the other two, was something approaching wonder, and it frightened people the most, so they mostly kept it to themselves. Cade Ranch was not simply a ranch. It was the largest landholding in the county. It employed 12 men permanently, and more during roundup. Its water rights controlled the creek that fed 2/3 of the smaller homesteads to the east. Without Harlan Cade's tacit agreement to keep the creek flowing unobstructed, an agreement that was nowhere written and everywhere understood, a dozen families would face a very different conversation about the sustainability of their land. What Harlan had just done was not a gift. Or rather, it was a gift so large that it changed the shape of everything around it. The way a stone dropped in still water doesn't just make ripples. It changes the fundamental nature of the surface. Judge Tate came to see Harlan at 11. Harlan was sitting on the bench outside the land registry. May Aldrich had left, he did not know where, drinking coffee from a tin cup as though it were an ordinary morning. "This is going to cause chaos," the judge said. He was a tall, spare man with a white beard and the weary eyes of someone who had spent 40 years watching people do things they could not undo. "Possibly," Harlan agreed. "The grazing rights alone. Fenwick has been running cattle on your north pasture since his father's time. You telling me a town board is going to manage that fairly?" "I'm telling you they'll manage it themselves," Harlan said, "which is more than they can say for the arrangement they've had." The judge looked at him for a long time. "Why?" he said. Harlan drank his coffee. He did not answer. May Aldrich was in the back room of the general store, behind the curtain, sitting on a barrel of flour. She was not weeping. She was not the kind of woman who wept as a first response. She was thinking, which for May was a physical activity. She pressed her hands together between her knees and stared at the middle distance and thought. What she thought about first was the letter that Harlan Cade had sent her 17 years ago. The letter that she had read once, standing in this same back room, and then burned. The letter that she had never answered and never spoken of, and had managed, across the intervening 17 years, to mostly stop thinking about. The letter in which Harlan Cade had told her, in the direct, unpolished language of a man not accustomed to writing letters, that he intended to leave the ranch to her, not an inheritance, not as charity, but as recognition of the fact that she had kept the commerce of Sweetwater Flats functioning through 3 hard winters when the railroad failed to deliver supplies, that she had done it without complaint and without credit, and that he thought the land should belong to someone who understood what land was for. She had burned the letter because she had understood, even then, that accepting it would mean something she was not prepared for it to mean. It would mean being seen. It would mean being named. It would mean the whole town knowing that Harlan Cade thought May Aldrich was the most capable person among them, and the whole town then having to decide what to do with that information, and May having to stand in the middle of that decision like a specimen. She had burned the letter. She had run the store. She had continued to manage, invisibly, the 1,000 small threads of commerce and credit and neighborly obligation that kept Sweetwater Flats from coming apart in the bad years. And now Harlan had done the thing he promised, 17 years later, but he had done it differently. He had not given it to her. He had given it to everyone. He had written the provision about the woman on the board, not because he thought women should serve on boards, though perhaps he did, but because he knew May Aldrich would be elected to that board within a week, and that she would then spend the rest of her working life managing the single largest common resource in the county without ever being called the owner of it. He had found a way to give it to her without giving it to her. She sat on the flour barrel for a long time. When she came back out front, Vera Hollis was waiting for her. "Don't," May said. "I haven't said a word," Vera said. She was 63, soft-voiced, with small, quick eyes that missed nothing. She had run the boarding house for 30 years, and in those 30 years she had, by the conservative estimate of anyone who thought about it, learned the private history of approximately every person who had ever passed through Sweetwater Flats. "Whatever you know," May said, "keep it." "I know what Harlan told your father," Vera said quietly, "the winter before your father died." May stopped moving. "I know what deal they made," Vera continued, "about the store and about the land and about you." The two women looked at each other across the counter. "Your father borrowed against the store in the bad winter of '89, Vera said. "He borrowed from Harlan, not the bank. Harlan forgave the debt on the condition that, when the time came, certain provisions would be made." "For me," May said. Her voice was very level. "For you," Vera confirmed. "Your father didn't tell you. I think he was ashamed, and I think he thought Harlan would handle it directly. But then your father went faster than anyone expected, and Harlan, well, Harlan is a man who doesn't know how to say a thing plainly when it involves the heart." May looked down at the counter. A long moment passed. "He's been waiting 17 years, she said. "It was not quite a question. He sent you that letter," Vera said. "How do you know about the letter?" "Because he asked me whether you'd received it," Vera said simply. "He never asked whether you'd read it. He already knew that." May put her hand flat on the counter. She breathed. "Why today?" she said. "Why now, after all this time?" Vera's voice was very gentle. "Because Doc Fenner told him in September," she said. "That his heart is failing." The afternoon brought more arguments. Fenwick, who had grazed his cattle on the north pasture for 20 years, came storming into the land registry at 2 o'clock and was informed by Burl Hayden, with the mournful precision of a man delivering bad news he has come to terms with, that the filing was complete and legal, and that challenges would need to go through the district court in Millbrook, which was 2 days' ride away, and which had a backlog of 3 years. Fenwick stormed back out. He encountered his neighbor, Peters, in the street. Peters, who had one of the eastern homesteads, and had spent the better part of the last decade quietly praying that Harlan would keep the creek unobstructed, was in a considerably more complicated emotional state than Fenwick. He understood that the common land arrangement, if properly managed, would codify in law the water access that had previously depended entirely on Harlan's goodwill. This was, depending on how you looked at it, either an extraordinary gift or a transformation of informal grace into bureaucratic process, and Peters was not yet sure which of those things was better. He and Fenwick argued about it for 45 minutes in the street. Two of Harlan's ranch hands, a young man named Cutler and an older one called Swede, sat on the steps of the saloon and watched the argument with the flat eyes of men trying to calculate what this meant for their wages. The ranch would continue operating under the Common Land Board. Harlan had specified as much in the deed, with provisions for employee continuity. But the confidence of men who work for a single decisive employer is a different animal from the confidence of men who work for a committee, and they both knew it. Swede had worked for Harlan for 19 years. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands and put it back on and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He's sick." Cutler looked at him. "What? That's why he did it now," Swede said. "Man wouldn't give away 4,000 acres out of generosity unless he was working on a deadline." They sat with that for a moment. "He give you anything?" Cutler asked. "In the deed, did he provide for the workers individually or just the continuity provision?" "Just the continuity," Swede said. Cutler nodded. He was 24 and had not yet learned that the stoic response to being left out of a dying man's legacy was the correct one, so he felt it openly for a moment before he put it away. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Swede agreed. Harlan ate supper that evening at the boarding house, which was where he always ate when he was in town. He had not eaten at the boarding house since June, and his arrival in the dining room caused the 6 other diners to fall into a brief silence before they collectively decided to ignore him, which is the loudest form of attention. Vera brought him his food without comment. He thanked her with a nod. May Aldrich walked in at 6:30. Every head in the room turned. May Aldrich did not eat at the boarding house. May Aldrich ate at the store or not at all, was the general understanding. She stood in the doorway with her coat still on and looked at Harlan Cade, sitting at the corner table. And then she crossed the room and sat across from him without invitation. Vera appeared at her elbow with a second plate, as though she had anticipated this, which she had. The other diners became extremely interested in their food. "You should have asked me," May said, quietly. The room was quiet enough that it didn't matter how quietly she spoke. Harlan looked up from his plate. "Would you have said yes?" A pause. "No. Then I couldn't ask you." "That's not—" she started, and then stopped herself. She picked up her fork and then put it down again. "You put a woman on the board provision in a public land deed so that I would be elected to manage the thing you couldn't give me directly." He said nothing. "Do you understand," she said carefully, "how it feels to be managed?" "I understand it differently than you do," he said. "I'm sorry for that." "You've been sorry for 17 years, she said. Privately. Very privately. He looked at her directly. His eyes were the faded blue of something that had once been a brighter color. "Your father asked me not to make you an object of the town's discussion," he said. "He thought it would embarrass you. The charity of it." May set down her fork. "It isn't charity," she said. "If someone earns it." "No," he said. "It isn't." Another silence. The room was very still. "Are you dying?" she said. The word landed on the table between them like a stone. "Fenner says 6 months," Harlan said. "Maybe a year if I am careful, which I have never been." May looked at the table. Something moved across her face. Grief. Or something adjacent to grief. The feeling of losing something you did not let yourself claim while you had the chance. She controlled it. She had a lifetime of practice. "You waited too long," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "You should have done this when my father died. You should have." She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," he said. "It matters, but it can't be changed," she said. "Those are two different things." He nodded slowly. He seemed to be acknowledging something larger than the specific sentence. "The board," she said after a moment. "If I'm elected." "You will be." "If I'm elected," she continued, with gentle firmness, "I will run the land the way I see fit, not the way you envisioned. My decisions, my judgments." "Of course," he said, as though no other outcome had ever occurred to him. "And Fenwick's grazing lease is going to be contested," she said. "Fairly, but contested." Something that might have been a smile moved at the corner of Harlan Cade's mouth. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. The week that followed was the most argued about week in the history of Sweetwater Flats, which was saying something for a town that had once had a 3-day dispute about the positioning of a water trough. The challenge to the deed came, as expected, from Fenwick and 2 of the larger cattle interests, who had relied on informal arrangements with Harlan for access to certain grazing routes. Their attorney, a man who rode in from Millbrook and seemed deeply unhappy about the journey, reviewed the document, conferred privately with Burl Hayden, and informed his clients that the deed was drafted with an irritating precision that suggested someone with legal training had been involved. What nobody in Sweetwater Flats knew, and what Vera knew and kept, was that Harlan Cade had spent 8 months corresponding with an attorney in Denver, and that the 8-month correspondence had cost him more than the annual operation of the ranch, and that he had spent that money with the focus calm of a man who had decided exactly where his resources were going. The district court challenge was filed. It would take, Burl Hayden said sadly, approximately 2 years to be heard. In the meantime, the deed stood. The town board election for the common land management was held 6 weeks after the filing, which was faster than any election in Sweetwater Flats had been held in living memory, a fact that said something about the town's relationship with urgency when the thing at stake was large enough. May Aldrich received 47 of the 63 votes cast. She accepted the election without ceremony or visible emotion, standing in the doorway of the general store in her apron as though the vote had interrupted her work rather than transformed her life. She thanked her neighbors in 2 sentences. She said she would do her best by the land and by the town. She went back inside. Through the window, if you were watching, and several people were, you could see her stand for a long moment at the counter with her back to the street and her hands flat on the wooden surface. Very still. Vera Hollis, who was watching from across the street, nodded to herself in the way of a woman whose understanding of the human heart has been confirmed once again. Harlan Cade stayed in Sweetwater Flats through November. He did not return to the ranch in any official capacity. The ranch foreman, a capable man named Doyle, took over operations without disruption, which was itself a testament to how Harlan had run things, systems designed to function without him. He rented a room at Vera's boarding house. He ate supper there most evenings. May Aldrich joined him for supper twice a week. This was noted. Everything was noted in Sweetwater Flats, but this in particular was noted and discussed at some length, and the conclusion reached, quietly, by the same gradual collective process by which weather and wisdom are both accepted, was that it was nobody's business and also possibly the best thing anyone had seen in some time. They were not demonstrative. They did not perform their changed relationship for the town's benefit. They talked. They talked about the land and the water rights and the history of the county and the best way to manage a common pasture and the probability of another hard winter and the question of whether Cutler, the young ranch hand, had the makings of a foreman in him, which May thought he did and Harlan was cautiously skeptical about. They talked about May's father once, in a quiet, careful conversation that lasted most of a November evening and left them both subdued and somehow lighter. They talked about the letter she had burned. "I reread it 100 times before I sent it," he said. "I knew it was wrong the whole time I was writing it." "It wasn't wrong," she said. "It was just unasked for." "What would have been the right way?" he said. It was a genuine question, asked by a man trying, at 61, to understand something he should have understood at 44. May thought about it seriously. She owed him a serious answer. "You could have asked me what I wanted," she said, "not told me what you intended to give. Asked." He absorbed this. "And if I had asked?" She looked at him across the table. Outside, the November wind was picking up, rattling the boarding house sign. "I don't know," she said. "I might have still said no. I was very determined to manage alone." "Were," he said. "Were," she agreed. Swede left the ranch in December. He was honest about his reasons when Doyle asked. He trusted a single man's word in a way he didn't trust a board's vote. And that wasn't a criticism of anyone. It was just a fact about himself. He went east, toward Millbrook. He left on a gray morning without ceremony, which was the only way Swede knew how to do anything. Cutler stayed. More than stayed. He applied to the Common Land Board for a formal foreman's position with a written proposal that surprised everyone who read it, including May, who read it twice. She voted to approve it. The board voted 4-1. Cutler, who had felt the unguarded grief of being left out of a dying man's bequest and had put it away and done the work anyway. Turned out to be exactly the kind of foreman Harlan's instincts said he was not, and May's instincts said he was. He would prove this over the next 3 years, patiently, through the kind of quiet competence that doesn't make for stories, but makes for a well-run operation. Fenwick's grazing lease was reduced by a third when the Common Land Board's first policy decisions were made in January. The reduction was legally impeccable, fairly argued, and offered Fenwick a preferential renewal rate in exchange for agreeing not to pursue the district court challenge any further. Fenwick, who was angrier than he was stubborn, an important distinction in the management of difficult men, agreed after 2 weeks of deliberation. Peters, on the Eastern homestead, woke one February morning to find the creek running full and clear, which it had always done under Harlan's informal management, and which now did so under a legally binding easement that his children and their children would be able to rely on. He stood at the creek bank, in the cold February light, for a long time. Then he went inside and did not speak of it, because some gratitude is too large for language. Harlan Cade died on a Tuesday in March, which was the same day of the week he had walked into the land registry 6 months before. Vera always thought that was meaningful. May, when she mentioned it, said that it was coincidence, and that meaning was something people added afterward to make themselves feel that events had structure. Then she was quiet for a moment and said, "But yes, I thought the same thing." The funeral was attended by most of Sweetwater Flats, which surprised nobody, and by a dozen people from outside the county whom nobody recognized, which surprised everyone. They were, it emerged, men who had worked for Harlan at different periods over 40 years. They had heard, by what channel was never clear, and they had come. They stood at the graveside in their various weathers, and said nothing, and then left the way they had come. May did not speak at the funeral. She had been asked, and she had declined. She stood with the town, and she listened to Judge Tate read the passage Harlan had requested, which was from Ecclesiastes, and which was about rivers running into seas, and the wind returning to its circuits, and which May privately thought was a more honest obituary than anything that could have been said about the man specifically. She put her hand on the casket once, briefly, and then she walked back to the general store. The spring was a good one. The creek ran strong. The north pasture put out the kind of early grass that makes cattle look prosperous and makes ranchers believe, briefly, that things will be fine. The Common Land Board met in April and then in May and found, to the moderate surprise of its members, that 5 people could make reasonable decisions together without it being a catastrophe. They argued. They voted. The votes were not always unanimous. The arguing was sometimes tense. May ran the meetings with the same brisk efficiency with which she ran the store. No ceremony, no sentimentality, clear agenda, decisions made and moved on from. The other board members, who had expected to have strong opinions about being managed by May Aldrich, discovered that they had underestimated the satisfaction of being managed well. The deed challenge wound its way through the district court with the glacial indifference of all legal processes and was decided, 2 years after filing, in the town's favor. The attorney from Millbrook informed Fenwick of this by letter, which Fenwick read, and then reread, and then set on the kitchen table, where it sat for 3 days before his wife picked it up and said that it was time to move on, which Fenwick, with the relief of a man who had been tired of fighting for some time, agreed to do. What the town remembered in the years after, and small towns remember, the way creeks remember their channels, was the moment outside the land registry, the gray October morning, the locked door, Harlan Cade with his document, and May Aldrich saying don't in the voice of a woman who could already see where the falling stone would land. What they slowly came to understand, the way slow understanding works, was that she had not been begging him to stop. She had been begging him because she already knew it was too late to stop. She had looked at the document at his hand, and she had known, in the way that people who have spent their lives reading the unspoken language of other people's intentions know, exactly what it was and what it would do. And she had said, don't the way you say it to something inevitable, the way you say it to weather, not to change it, just to acknowledge that you saw it coming and you were afraid. There is a kind of courage that looks like stubbornness from the outside. Harlan Cade had it. He had held a conviction for 17 years and carried it through silence and waiting and his own particular inability to simply say the plain thing, and he had done the plain thing anyway at the end. in the only way he knew how, in a public act that could not be refused or burned or left unanswered. There is a different kind of courage, quieter, that looks like going back inside the store. May Aldrich had that kind. She had been practicing it for 30 years. She went on practicing it, at the Common Land Board and at the general store, and in the life she built around both, in the town that had been given, without its asking, the enormous complicated inheritance of having to take care of itself. The land was not a monument to Harlan Cade. He had been too practical for monuments. It was a question he had asked. Not will you accept this gift? Not will you be seen? The question was, when I am gone, will you manage? And the answer, given daily, in the running of meetings and the signing of leases and the decisions about water and grass and the claims of the living upon what the earth can reasonably give. The answer was yes. The answer had always been yes. That was what he had known, and what she had known he knew, and what they had both carried in their separate silences for 17 years before one October morning when a man with a failing heart walked into a locked building and did the one thing that everyone begged him not to, and everything afterward was the consequence of that, and the consequence was not ruin. The consequence was the rest of their lives.